Muy buenos días a todas y todos los y las aquí presentes y a todas las personas que nos siguen por el Facebook. Como saben, este evento es transmitido en vivo a través del Facebook del Centro de Estudios Filosóficos. Les doy la bienvenida a este seminario sobre la actualidad del pensamiento de Hegel 2024. Quiero saludar y agradecer de modo especial a nuestros invitados y conferencistas extranjeros, a los profesores Tobias Wieland de la Universidad Libre de Berlín, Ana María Miranda, especialista mexicana de la Universidad Técnica de Dresde, a Marc Meschalk de la Universidad Católica de Lovaina, a Yemir Bavaresco de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Río Grande do Sul y a Juan Ormeño de la Universidad Diego Portales de Chile. Todos ellos son muy buenos conocedores de la obra de Hegel y de su relevancia en los debates contemporáneos, de manera que su participación enriquecerá nuestras discusiones. Y extiendo también el saludo, por supuesto, a los ponentes o comentaristas de libros de diferentes universidades peruanas y del extranjero que nos acompañarán en estos 2 días. Es un seminario anual que organiza el grupo de investigación dedicado a reflexionar sobre la actualidad o la vigencia de la obra de Hegel, el grupo Hegel de la PUC, como se le conoce escuetamente. El tema del seminario de este año es, como saben, Hegel y la pluralidad de las formas de vida. Queremos así iluminar un aspecto del debate contemporáneo sobre la compleja relación entre las cosmovisiones culturales, en su autonomía, las culturas, su autonomía, sus criterios normativos, la posibilidad de su crítica inmanente, sus múltiples interacciones y sobre los rezagos de colonialidad en la cultura occidental. La filosofía de Hegel ha jugado allí un papel importante y por eso es que nos ocuparemos a partir de allí de este tema. En la concepción de Hegel se concede a cada cultura, al espíritu de cada pueblo, el mismo derecho a defender la racionalidad o la institucionalización de las formas de vida procedentes de su libertad autónoma, aunque sea de un modo relativo. Pero ello ocurre de forma paradójica, pues la defensa de su autonomía parece sujetarse igualmente a un criterio normativo más universal, que sería el de la definición conceptual de la eticidad. El grupo Hegel de la PUC tiene una participación muy activa de estudiantes en el Perú y en el extranjero. Son ahora 15 personas y tienen mucha iniciativa, no solo en la organización de estas jornadas, sino también en la formación de grupos de lectura y otras actividades. Nuestra idea de llamar a este evento un seminario es porque esperamos tener también interacción, participación de los estudiantes, preguntas, etc. En este seminario, mañana por la noche, vamos a presentar además 2 libros que son obra del grupo Hegel. Uno titulado La pérdida de la eticidad, la crisis presente en clave hegeliana, y otro titulado Hegel y el círculo de las ciencias. Esos 2 libros son de libre acceso y en los anuncios que hemos hecho en el programa, en las redes, podrán ustedes acceder a los libros de manera y sin ningún problema y por supuesto gratuitamente. Y además nuestro grupo se preocupa por publicar siempre sus propias reuniones y por eso es que también el año pasado, en el seminario del grupo Hegel del año pasado, hicimos una presentación de 2 libros que fueron también fruto de nuestra actividad. Quiero agradecer finalmente al equipo del Centro de Estudios Filosóficos, a Mariana Chu, su directora, a Bárbara Betoque y a Eliana Mera por su apoyo constante, al doctor Miguel Rodríguez Montoñedo, jefe del Departamento de Humanidades, cuyo respaldo y apoyo logístico ha sido muy importante, al vicerrectorado de investigación de la universidad, que nos apoya con un respaldo financiero, y a todos los miembros del grupo Hegel, que son los verdaderos promotores de estos seminarios. Dicho todo esto, vamos a pasar a la primera conferencia, a la conferencia inaugural, que va a estar a cargo de Tobias Wieland desde Berlín, y que será una conferencia que escucharemos y veremos de manera virtual en esta pantalla, con un equipo técnico que además es muy bueno, de manera que vamos a poder escuchar y ver con mucha nitidez. Presento al profesor Wieland, en primer lugar. Tobias Wieland se doctoró en filosofía en la Universidad Libre de Berlín, con una tesis titulada La pluralidad del absoluto, la teoría hegeliana del cambio social, publicada luego por la editorial Vittorio Klosterman en el año 2022. Hizo estudios previos de filosofía en esa misma universidad, con estadías en otras universidades europeas. Actualmente es profesor y coordinador del grupo de investigación sobre normatividad, crítica y cambio de la Universidad Libre de Berlín. Con dicho grupo ha organizado diversos coloquios y seminarios internacionales. Además del libro mencionado, ha publicado muchos artículos en revistas especializadas, tanto sobre la filosofía de Hegel como sobre teoría crítica, filosofía social, decolonialidad, feminismo y emancipación. Es miembro activo del Instituto de Investigación sobre Cuerpo y Cultura Sexual de Berlín y participa de otras iniciativas ciudadanas sobre estos temas. El profesor Wieland nos visitó en el mes de marzo, invitado por el Centro de Estudios Filosóficos y el Grupo Hegel de esta universidad, y en esa ocasión nos dio también algunas charlas. Los voy a dejar con él. Su conferencia, que será leída en inglés, se titula On the Question of the Concrete Universal, the Plurality of Life Forms in a Critical Continuation of Hegel. La conferencia va a ser proyectada en la pantalla para que puedan seguirla, pero el profesor además entiende castellano, de manera que le podrán hacer preguntas. Dejo con ustedes al profesor Wieland. Adelante, Tobias.
Sí, Miguel, muchísimas gracias por esta invitación y la presentación tan amable. Me da mucha alegría y también orgullo participar en este seminario y dar la presentación inaugural, aunque sea de modalidad híbrida. Como Miguel ha dicho, lo voy a leer mi texto y mi pensamiento sobre la actualidad y el pluralismo en la filosofía de Hegel en inglés, pero sí les quiero invitar a hacer sus preguntas en castellano, ¿ya? Para esta modalidad bilingüe, sí, eso sí funciona bien para mí, pero sí me cuesta muchísimo presentar mis preguntas en español. Entonces, les pido permiso que voy a presentar mis pensamientos en inglés. Aún no puedo compartir mi pantalla, no, me hace falta la permisión.
A ver,
¿Cómo hacemos?
¿ya puedes? ¿Le puede
A ver,
dar autorización al profesor Wieland para que comparta, por favor?
eh, a ver, ¿dónde está?
Sí, ahora deberías.
Ahora debería.
Thailand.
Thailand, sí, pero no. Ah, Vorschau. This one. Uh, sorry. So it's the same. Maybe we just do it as we said, that you can present it because I don't have the My Zoom is not set up for this. I'm sorry. We should have tested this beforehand, actually. I'm very sorry. Später. No, I will not be able to. Yes, thank you. Yes,
Okay,
yes. Okay. Yes. Gracias, Miguel. Sí, entonces voy a empezar. So my very question is, what can we learn from Hegel's notion of the concrete universal? And I like to start with saying that Hegel's notion of the concrete universal challenges conventional notions of the relationship between the abstract and the concrete. That's to say, unlike classical understandings of universal as exclusively as abstract, that's to say, noumenal entities, Hegel's speculative conception holds that true universals embody both abstract and concrete qualities. And that is to say, than rather being static, the concrete universal is dynamic and evolving. That is something to be shown in greater detail in regards to the science of logics, but I will not do this today. Today, I will try to push things forward and to contend that such a speculative understanding of the concrete universal can contribute to contemporary discussions regarding epistemic politics of identity and also of coloniality. That's to say that subaltern theories and resistant knowledge projects offer a framework to critique and challenge the partial and exclusionary model of universality, which is propagated by Western philosophical traditions. In actualizing Hegel's speculative dialectics of the concrete universal, I think we can benefit from this notion in response to the need for a critical reassessment and decolonization of identity, recognition, and epistemic politics. That's to say, what is at stake here is the problem of what we can call the anti-blackness and the violence of Western predominance. This problem shall not be denied, but it is taken as a critical point of departure for what I would couch as a conflict of culture, a culture of conflict, incorporating an epistemic praxis of recognition in the light of what we can call the normative ideal of communicative freedom. The driving ambition of my present engagement with Hegel is an attempt to think with Hegel against Hegel. The pivotal question that guides me in this inquiry here is whether, and if so, how are we to conceptualize Hegel's speculative dialectical approach to intercultural, intercolonial philosophy? Central to this endeavor is openness to dialogue, openness to the exchange of ideas, recognition, and reconciliation. And that is to say, we have here at stake classical Hegelian signature ideas, such as recognition and reconciliation. And I like to use these ideas as, let's say, the foundational pillar for an intercultural philosophy. In the emerging field of post-colonial and or decolonial studies, as well as in critical race theory, many contributions have engaged with the Hegelian corpus to elucidate the crucial role of Hegel's philosophy as a master narrative of Western modernity. My driving idea in this article is to link the phenomenology of recognition with the logical structure of contradiction. So that's to say, I like to think with Hegel against Hegel. That's to say, I will take the criticism of Hegel's racist and colonialist philosophy, but not to get rid of this, but in order to engage with this critically is I think, the reason why we have to go back to the science of logics. So that's my attempt. So that was the outline. At the very heart of my inquiry lies the systematic core idea, which is encapsulated by the concept of concrete universal. Contrary to conventional notions of unity, that is to say, notions of unity based on identity, I think what we can find in Hegel is a way to understand the concrete universal as asserting a unity which is grounded in difference, identity in difference. Speculation is thinking identity in difference. Undoubtedly, Hegel's presentation of universalism is intertwined with his philosophy of the historical development of human consciousness. Hegel classifies Africans as people arrested at the lowest and most mediate stage of consciousness, that is of senses. Asians, according to Hegel, are people with a divided consciousness, whereas Europeans are the people of reason. In the attempt to actualize Hegel's speculative notion of the concrete universal, My aim is not to negate such a wrongness in Hegel's philosophy of history, but to use his own method to develop an understanding of it that integrates and bears responsibility for the fact of its colonial and racist wrongness. This presupposes a contextual and embodied notion of conceptual critique, or immanent critique, we might say. As Hegelians, I do think we have to stay with the trouble, to borrow a beautiful term that I find in Donna Haraway. To my understanding, the core feature of speculative dialectics and the attempt of an immanent critique of thinking or of rationality is to grasp identity not as sameness, but as something that is brought about through the dynamic interplay of self-motion and self-determination. Central to this framework is an understanding of absolute cognition as a method of contextual thinking, wherein self-motion and self-determination unfold with the other. According to Hegel, absolute, I'm sorry for the typo, absolute denotes neither infallibility nor ultimacy, but rather the capacity for dynamic self-motion, what Hegel calls a universal absolute activity, allgemeine absolute Tätigkeit. In articulating relation and communication as the normative core of identity, we gain a standard for an immanent critique of Hegel's racist philosophy of history. So in order to spell out that standard of communication, I will start with some remarks on the reception of Hegel's, I think, most prominent book, which is The Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel's modern promise of trust has played a big role in French reception and has been put forward by Koujaev and Bataille, among many others, in order to back up the colonial critique of Hegel, which often then takes Hegel's phenomenology of spirit as a starting point, most precisely the dialectic of master and servants, and that is the access point for disputing his Eurocentrism epistemically. The argument that has played a big role in these debates could be reconstructed as follows. Hegel's fundamental insight concerns the instability of the master's subjectivity. As for Hegel, subjectivity exists in the two main dimensions of work and struggle, or labor and struggle, we might say. The struggles we fight and the labor we execute contribute to the reproduction of the life of spirit. That's to say that we achieve subjectivity by contributing to the substance reproduction. Normatively speaking, we deserve recognition for the work and struggle we bring about in our lives. This normative mechanism, this what I will later call with Robert Brandom, his promise of trust, that is a mechanism that consists in understanding or is based upon an understanding of work and struggle as contributions to the reproduction of the spirit. It is in this precisely what the master's, and in this precisely, it is what the master undermines in not recognizing the servant's recognition. The master, so to speak, lives off preconditions which he neither reproduces nor recognizes. And this is why the master's subjectivity lives in a form of life that's unsustainable. In this light, the servant is epistemically in a position more advanced than the master. The servant's knowledge integrates the speculative ontology of interdependency of life and the request of recognition of labor and conflict as forms of social reproductions. The Hegelian community of spirit incorporates the normative mechanism of granting recognition for labor and struggle. Absolute knowledge is in this sense contextual knowledge that can reflect upon its conditions of life. That's to say, we have to think about the relation of the science of logics and the phenomenology of spirit. Absolute knowledge as dialectical understanding of itself is aware of its own condition, so to speak. There is a relation between logics and phenomenology. As Hegel envisions it, the community of trust lives up to the promise of trust. The community of the emancipated spirit will recognize all forms of work and expressivity. And this is where I find Hegel's modernity. That's to say that the promise of trust is, in my eyes, intrinsically pluralistic. There is no reason why to limit the contributions to the life of spirit to a certain setup or a certain understanding or a certain form of expressivity, a certain frame of recognition. I think this intrinsic pluralism is linked to the validity of the standard of what I call here the promise of trust, or the mechanism of granting a recognition for work and struggle. However, and building on work on the racial hierarchy in the nature-spirit distinction that structures Hegel's thought, we can say that the onto-epistemic coordinates of this distinction of nature and spirit that is at play in his philosophy inscribe indeed a form of anti-blackness own account of the world, history, and geography. I'd adapted here to someone as Rocio Zambrana, who contributed significantly on these questions. And I think, given his own standard, Hegel falls short in granting the institutionalization and the philosophy that does deal with the pluralism. So it's not to say that Hegel as such is a pluralist, it's to say we have to deal with this intrinsic notion of pluralism in his philosophy, and this is what fuels an immanent critique of his philosophy in my eyes. The premise of such an understanding of communal emancipation, that's to say emancipation is nothing that is brought about only by a subject, but only in regards to its substance, that's to say its community. So I cannot be free just on my own. This has been famously argued for in Hegel's uptake, as Hegel's uptakes of Rousseau's social philosophy. Most prominently, it was Friedrich Neuhauser who put forward this kind of reading. But I think it's also by a reference to Judith Butler that we can shed some lights on this and make it more tangible. The phenomenology of communal emancipation puts a speculative ontology of the body at stake, which allows us to express both the power and the precarity of life. Next, yes, thank you. I quote Butler, "The boundary of who I am is the boundary of the body, but the boundary of the body never fully belongs to me." This is what we can call the interdependency. This interdependency of the spirit makes all human life precarious, but is also simultaneously the reason why desire, love, trust are possible. The generalized condition, this is another quote from Butler, the generalized condition of precariousness of the human being implies a political contextual framework. A community of spirit would do justice to the speculative ontology of the body, allowing for the recognition of its precariousness and also of its expressive power. The normative authority within the community of spirit aims at actualizing such a freedom. However, norms of freedom are not a given, but a result of the normative mechanism of the spirit of trust, which presupposes what Butler calls frames of recognition. The normative mechanism, labor and struggle for recognition, continuously reproduce prevailing recognition frames. Yet, the normative promise of trust is ambivalent. Any form of recognition, even when successful, is also a form of misrecognition. A history recollected in the light of normative commitments, central to the form of life, at the same time forgets, buries, and also makes invisible and even pathologizes forms of labor and struggle that do not gain authority within the prevailing Western modernity. Within the prevailing frames of recognition. The promise of trust, as we have it nowadays, incorporated in our institutions, is what heteronormative liberal capitalism of Western modernity notoriously fails to deliver for the racialized and gendered dimensions of marginalized forms of life. The tremendous amount of care work within the domestic realm and beyond reduces female expressivity and remains an explicit demand without recognition. Care work remains a precondition of life of the spirit, yet, as a form of labor, care remains relatively unconscious. The frames of recognition that we engage in shape the recognizability of life preceding the actual practice of recognition. The human condition of relationality and interdependency does not render us equal, but the struggles and labels, as well as the recognition that are granted in return, are distributed along racialized, gendered, and classist lines of exclusion. The promise of trust is encapsulated within the dialectics of master and servant. It is fleshed out during the unfolding of the phenomenology of spirit. Yet it is executed Yet, as it is executed in this book, Hegel's immanent critique still leaves out a significant problem of the Western politics of recognition. This concerns the intimate association of modernity and slavery as a fundamental conceptual issue. And I think I should highlight conceptual issue here. It's just an issue that kind of is secondary to an understanding of modernity. It's a systematic question of how to account for the relation of modernity and slavery. It is Paul Gilroy, for example, or most prominently, I think he was the first in making this explicit, who said that starting with Hegel, while having the intimate of sorry, I'm losing myself. Paul Gilroy holds that starting with Hegel, while having the intimate association of modernity and slavery in view, it allows us to understand conflict and the form of dependency produced in the relationship between master and slave as issues of brutality and terror, which is also too frequently ignored by Hegelian scholarship. Following Gilroy here, this offers an opportunity to reject the Eurocentric rationalism without having to hold an, I quote, equally Occidental anti-humanism, which locates the origins of modernity's current crisis in the shortcomings of the Enlightenment project. Instead, this is how I take it, of abstractly rejecting the promise of trust, which is at the very core of the Enlightenment project, we can also try to push forward Hegel's immanent critique of modern subjectivity. In the tradition of the French Hegelianism, Kojève, Hippolyte, Sartre, and Fanon, and many others, decolonial theories argued with Hegel's dialectics of master and slave against Hegel's Eurocentric philosophy of history. In this spirit, yet turning away from the phenomenology, we ask what the science of logics and the immanent conceptual critique can offer for a critical and decolonial theory of normativity. And this brings us now to the very question of, what it is, what we call dialectics. So the following section delves into an exploration of the concept of speculative dialectics. We will abstract from the epistemic politics of embodied recognition for a moment, but we will return to this level of concreteness after having engaged with Hegel's realm of shadows, that's to say with Hegel's science of logic. The driving idea here is to link the phenomenology of recognition with the logical structure of contradiction, which shapes the recognizability of the body. So that's to say, recognition and contradictions are not the same. However, recognition presents a contradictory conceptual structure, as to be oneself is to be oneself in the other. To recognize is to become part of the other while being dismembered in this transition. This also implies that the other is becoming part of oneself. Thus, recognition bears a teleologically contradictory structure. Recognition constitutes a part that is a whole that is a part. Most significant here is to make explicit what is often implicit in the criticism of dialectical thinking, namely to imagine contradictions as unthinkable. And I think this is the crucial point that I take from Hegel. We shall not, I read him as a dialetist. That's to say, I do think that Hegel holds that contradictions are true. And that is the reason why I engage now with Hegel's science of logics in a greater detail, without aiming at an interpretation of the entire book. I just look at a very specific part of this book, which is the doctrine of essence. Within Hegel's science of logic, the final standpoint articulates absolute cognition, which means dialectical thinking keeps itself in motion. This is to say that dialectical thinking incorporates analytical, synthetical thinking at its moments, yet transcending their constraints and supposed foundational laws. Though there is a quote from the Science of Logic. I'm going to read it out in German just to diversify the language here in the room, but you find the English translation also on the Partei, on the screen. Dieses so sehr synthetische als analytische Moment des Urteils, wodurch das anfängliche Allgemeine aus ihm selbst als das andere seiner sich bestimmt, ist das Dialektische zu nennen. Die Dialektik ist eine derjenigen alten Wissenschaften, welche in der Metaphysik der Modernen und dann überhaupt durch die Popularphilosophie sowohl der alten als auch der neuen am meisten verkannt worden. So this idea that dialectics is something we have to do justice to and shall not be misjudged. I think the reason why dialectics has often been misjudged, according to Hegel, is the reason that we hold on to the doctrine of the unthinkability of contradiction. Yeah, and I do think that Hegel indeed questions the doctrine of the unthinkability of the contradiction. This statement sets the stage for his departure from Aristotle's perspective and introduces Hegel's critical inquiry into the traditional understanding of the contradiction as unthinkable. So Hegel tells us, maybe un poco más hacia abajo, por favor. Yes, because I'm going to read out the original again. Das spekulative Denken besteht nur darin, dass das Denken den Widerspruch und in ihm sich selbst festhält. Nicht aber, dass es sich, wie es dem Vorstellen geht, von ihm beherrschen und durch ihn sich seine Bestimmungen nur in andere und in nichts auflösen lässt. So that's to say that the very idea of a speculative thought is to hold firm to contradictions and find itself in the contradiction. And I think this very idea to use the notion of contradiction as something that drives thinking, and it's not alien to thinking. It's not something we just run into accidentally, but we have to seek the contradiction. And that's to say we have to find the contradiction in order to spell out the very essence of the object of thought. This is what I think the most critical idea in speculative thinking, according to Hegel. This passage challenges the traditional notion of that contradictions are inherently unthinkable and proposes a re-evaluation. That's to say, it keeps suggesting that the contradiction is intrinsic to life and that life is dynamic. It's a dynamic process of relation and communication. Instead of repeating the basic prejudice of the unthinkability of the contradiction, Hegel turns things upside down. Contradiction is life. Life is what becomes itself in the other. Life is relation. The immanent law of objectivity is communication. That's a quote from the later of the book. But this idea starkly contrasts classical logics, which upholds the principle of non-contradiction, stating that two contradictory propositions cannot simultaneously be true in the same sense. Hegel's dialectism opens a new avenue for philosophical inquiry by prompting us to reconsider the nature of logic and reality. I'm going to stay for a moment longer with Hegel's doctrine of essence by presenting what I would like to call a typology of differences. That is the conceptual or the exegetical work I like to present here. What is Hegel? What is that Hegel is doing there in the doctrine of essence? He presents us with a typology of differences, and at the very end of this typology, we have to consider the transition from contradiction to reason. And this is what this next section will hopefully manage in bringing about. So the idea is to consider the nature of logic and reality, but in order to do so, we must focus on the central passage of the doctrine of essence in the second book of the Science of Logic. Hegel presents here a structured and abstract elucidation of the thinkability of contradictions through a typology of differences, which he calls himself Denkbestimmungen. I think this is his translation for categories. Determinations of thought is his notion for categories. So the first category here concerns diversity. Diversity is the English translation by Giovanni for Verschiedenheit. And that is a category that presents a contrarian negation. That's to say, it might be a bit abstract now. The law of non-contradiction characterizes this type of negation. However, the law of the excluded middle does not hold, as other possibilities are feasible. Consequently, Hegel concludes that diversity relations fail to establish a comprehensive totality. Think of colors, for example. To say of something that something is red is quite compatible to say it's not yellow, it's not green, it's not blue. That's the principle of non-contradiction. But by by the law of excluded middle is not in place here, you cannot inverse this typology. You cannot say something is not yellow, therefore it's blue, because it could be anything else. It could be pink. So in this sense, colors do not present a closed totality or comprehensive totality. Yeah, they are open to any forms of addition, so to speak. And this is different in Hegel's second category, which is the category of the opposition, which is the translation for Gegensatz. And this is, logically speaking, presenting us with the contradictory negation. The law of non-contradiction applies too, whereas this determination of thought is not determined by the law of the excluded middle. Hegel argues that relations of opposition form a totality, which he defines as a comprehensive entity comprising of indifferent differences. Within this totality, contradictory negations maintain their inherent identities despite the oppositional relation. So anything that's an either or in this sense forms a totality. So you can leap from one to the other, from the negation to the affirmation and from the affirmation to the negation. Something is either black or white. These are all types or forms of oppositional relations. So, but Hegel continues and elaborates a third type of difference, and he does so under the concept of the contradiction of the concept of contradiction, Widerspruch. And it is here where he introduces the notion of the concrete negation, neither denoted by the law of non-contradiction nor by the law of the excluded middle. This typology of differences encapsulates the idea that both A and non-A can simultaneously be true, emphasizing the complex nature of the contradiction. Hegel argues that relations of contradiction form a totality of concrete determinations, illustrating the intricate interplay between opposing elements within his dialectical framework. He presents an alternative perspective on the conventional doctrine of the unthinkability of contradiction by delineating the intelligibility or intelligible boundaries of contradiction through his typology of differences. In his framework, no singular first principle exists, something akin to A equals A or such a thing. The totality manifests itself as life. The manifestation is what Hegel symbolizes as the circle of circles. This comes more tangible in the ultimate determination of thought, which Hegel discusses, and that is what he calls the determination of ground. Yeah, so I'm here now looking at the transition from Widerspruch zu Grund. And I think I will read out the German original again, but you find the English translation above. Der Grund ist daher selbst eine der Reflexionsbestimmungen des Wesens. Aber die letzte, vielmehr nur die Bestimmung, dass sie aufgehobene Bestimmung ist. Aufgehobene Bestimmung, sublated determination. Die Reflexionsbestimmung, indem sie zugrunde geht, erhält ihre wahrhafte Bedeutung. Der absolute Gegenstoß ihrer in sich selbst zu sein, nämlich, dass das Gesetztsein, das dem Wesen zukommt, nur als aufgehobenes Gesetztsein ist und umgekehrt, dass nur das sich aufhebende Gesetztsein das Gesetztsein des Wesens ist. Das Wesen, indem es sich als Grund bestimmt, bestimmt sich als das Nichtbestimmte und nur das Aufheben seines Bestimmtseins ist sein Bestimmen. So that's to say, in determining itself as ground, essence determines itself as the not determined, and only the sublating of its being determined is its determining. This is what I'm aiming at. The understanding ground as the truth of contradiction is not to say that ground presents us a synthetic unity of oppositions. It's to say that we have to understand that at the very core of essence, what we find here is negativity. Yeah, negativity as the process of sublating determinacy by opening it up to another possibility. That is what he means by saying that is the truth understanding of Wesen. Ja? Wesen, indem es sich als Grund bestimmt, bestimmt sich als das Nichtbestimmte. Ja? As not determined. And I think this is the intricate idea here, that if we are to understand contradiction as something that is real and constitutes the logical form of life, then the core here is that we have to reject a specific understanding of ground. That's to say the ground of all being is the negation of being determined. And I think in the context of the book, Hegel makes it very explicit that this is a way to reject the Leibnizian idea of the sufficient reason. This is to say, there is no positive supreme being that entails all possibilities. Hegel explicitly dismisses Leibniz's position of a proposition of a characteristic universals as concepts, as a standard language, as if it were a Schriftsprache, emphasizing the inequality of such a notion. That's to say, we shall not understand the final reason or the ultimate reason as entailing all possibilities. That's to say, that's a positivistic understanding of reason, of ground. We have to put instead a understanding at play that allows us to understand negativity and the sublating of determinacy as the very reason of reason, so to speak, and or the Grund des Grundes. But this does not leave us with a mystical or irrational élan vital or something along these lines, because Hegel's category of the ground of life about the communication is depicted as intelligible within Hegel's framework. It emphasizes, so it's not mystical. It has a certain logical structure, but we need a dialectical framework in order to see the structure. And that's to say that we have to emphasize the necessity for a profound re-evaluation of the realm of shadows, indicating a deeper understanding of the actuality of life. Dialectic, in this context, represents contextual knowledge rather than a priori knowledge, highlighting its reliance on the specific circumstances and conditions of the situation or the context. The circle that closes is the circle that opens. And following Sabrana again, we are to understand that Hegel's notion of actualization, Verwirklichung, is a process of determinate negation, yet in which the result must be understood as precarious and ambivalent. The whole is never one, but always already a process. Hegel's typology of differences neither presents an unthinkable antagonism nor an unresolvable tragedy, but rather a tension, invoking the idea of reconciliation as rendering productive the complexities of life. Concrete negation puts neither paradox on display. The notion of contradiction puts forward the inner tension of life, of the spirit, as being spontaneous and receptive, as being free and also being bound by laws. Therefore, ambivalence, openness, and non-closure lay at the core of Hegel's notion of reflection. In the science of logic, Hegel treats the reflection problem, the problem of Reflexion, and ties it to Entäußerung, externalization. In Hegel's own words, reflection is the movement of becoming and transitioning that remains internal, transition that remains internal to it. And I'm following Christopher Humans here, who has aptly argued that reflection must be understood in terms of the problem of expression. Expression is a doing. It is, accordingly, a matter of actuality. Expressivity contains an outward movement, and it returns to itself in this outward movement. Such a deflection, the turning or bending backward into the self-distinctive, is distinctive of reflection, and turns out to be the manifestation of actuality. The manifestation of actuality, in turn, is correctly understood in terms of Wechselwirkung, which is, Wechselwirkung is an Hegelian term. We might translate this as reciprocity. Reflection is thereby only adequately conceived of as the reflexivity of actuality. This indicates that the truth of essence is the concept, which requires an account of the idea which Hegel glosses as the unity of concept and reality. So that's to say, we are always already in this bending backwards process. There is no such a thing as mere identity. Everything is in relation, but the awareness, the consciousness of this being in itself, being oneself in the other, that is what we need the concept for in order to do justice to our own reality. That's basically the point that I'm trying to bring about here. That something has actual identity means that it is established, it's established itself in self-determination, but in self-determination, it relates itself substantially to something else. In substantial relations, oneself to the other, we gain identity and open ourselves to change. And here again, I quote, sublating of its being determined is its only determining. Thus, the boundaries of identities are always both transcendent and open, making everything less clear-cut. And I think this is what we have to I mean, I would like just to quickly remind you of this staying with the trouble from Donna Haraway. I love this notion because I think it's true because of that very reason. We have to acknowledge that the boundaries of identity are not fixed in a given, but they are open. And that's to say, we are not in a position to clear-cutly separate between us or the identity and difference. And I think this is a crucial insight from Hegel's ontology. Reflection along the lines of Hegel takes a stance and does not happen in the void of observing reason. Reflection also determines the object and hence changes its relation to its object. Therefore, we cannot provide simple answers and must acknowledge the ethics of ambiguity. And here again, or this time I'm borrowing a term from Simone de Beauvoir, this idea of an ethics of ambiguity. That's to say, the good, true, and the beautiful bear their own ambivalences. And that is the ontological ground for engaging with the question of spirit of trust. And this is the last part of my presentation. Okay. I hope you're still with me, despite the rather abstract character of my engagement here. But this short engagement with the doctrine of essence shall not provide a detailed interpretation of the entire science of logic. That's a crazy attempt. It's a crazy book, but it's a beautiful book. I love this book. I just want to kind of cherry pick some of its blossoms, and that's to say, this idea that relation and communication is at the very core of identity, and that's to say, we have to deal with the ambivalences of the relation of identity and difference. However, it shall justify this brief engagement, shall justify highlighting a crucial moment of embodied recognition, and that's to say, the contradictory character of life and recognition on an ontological level. It is not by accident that we run into contradictions. They are part and parcel of the life of spirit. But how are we then to bring this ontological insight back to a more concrete, let's just say, political level? And this brings me back to the notion of the promise of trust or the spirit of trust. That's an insightful interpretation brought forward by Robert Brandom, in which he presents a reading of the phenomenology of spirit, which proposes a conception of normativity that transcends both the limitations of modernity and also of the critiques of modernities. Brandom's Hegel advocates for a hermeneutics of magnanimity. That's to say, Brandom tries to show that we have to link trust and what Brandom calls the magnanimous agency. Brandom's Hegel emphasizes the importance of an expansive and generous interpretive frame of recognition in the light of a post-analytical understanding of logic. Brandom contrasts Hegel's immanent deduction of conceptual norms with the genealogy by Nietzsche and Foucault, and who both challenge conventional notions of normativity by highlighting its dependence on contingent factors that undermine its stability. According to Brandom's Hegel, trust, magnanimity, and reconciliation are central to the normativity of the spirit of modernity. These principles form the basis for Hegel's vision of normativity, guiding the dialectical process towards a deeper understanding of human agency and societal reconciliation. Brandom's exploration sheds light on its crucial aspect of trust and normativity, which concerns the transitivity of trust. That's to say, if A trusts B and B trusts C, therefore there is a relation of trust between A and C. That's to say, friends are friends are friends. By emphasizing the relational nature of substance building, Brandom challenges the notion of self-determination as mere independence and helps to spell out the idea of self-determination as reflexive and cumulative reflection. What is particularly helpful, I think, what is helpful here is the idea of self-determination as something that necessitates the integration of external influences and contingencies for the actuality of subjectivity. In this view, openness and trust towards the perspectives of others become foundational for self-reflexive determination or reflexive self-determination. However, a critical perspective arises when considering magnanimity. While random extols its virtues, it is essential to recognize that magnanimity often operates within a framework of privileges. The ability to forgive and to transcend violence may be contingent upon one's social standing and power relations. To forgive is a privilege, a social status. Therefore, while magnanimity is laudable, its application and accessibility are deeply entwined with broader social dynamics in inequalities. The critical lens prompts us to question the underlying assumptions and implications of magnanimity within societal structures and power relations. And this brings me then to the next part, which is under the title of Politics of Trust and Human Freedom. Because I think there is a potential clash between normativity based on trust and the reality of moral wrongness. This presents a significant challenge to Brandam's idea of magnanimity as a base for a modern understanding of normativity. Because a normativity based on the transitivity of trust encounters a severe objection, and that is the existence of moral wrongness. What if the friend of a friend is a perpetrator? What could be an Hegelian answer to this problem? So let's stay for a moment with the problem of perpetration or moral wrongness, to put it that way. From the perspective of moral liberalism, exemplified by Kant, freedom is perceived as self-legislation by the categorical imperative. According to this view, morally wrong actions are not truly free, as the categorical imperative does not bind them. Instead, such a human behavior is constrained by innate desires and inclinations. Kant acknowledges that individuals often act based on prudential, that's to say, hypothetical reasons, aiming to achieve personal happiness. However, Kant is pessimistic and does not expect all individuals, especially those in power, to adhere to the categorical imperative or categorical reasoning in their actions. In this sense, we may articulate the difference between noumena and phenomena as a radical form of universalism. I will try to flesh this out in greater detail by a reference to Omri Böhm. The difference between noumena and phenomena is at stake in an attempt to re-articulate the question of ongoing political wrongness from a liberal point of view. Omri Böhm, his radical in universalism, advocates, based on the regulative idea of the categorical imperative, a form of universalism that opposes the post-colonial critique of human rights as constructs arising from a specific socio-political condition of the liberal West, and henceforth as impositions on non-Western societies and communities. So Böhm tries to reject this critique. And how does he do so? Based on three, what he calls human rights constellations. And in his book, Radical Universalism, he engages in great detail with the American Civil War and slavery, the story of Abraham, which is supposed to sacrifice his son, and then the conflict between Israel and Palestina, in showing how these constellations bring about a normative standard, which is the standard of human rights constellations. Böhm argues that human rights are not legal stipulations, but universally valid truth grounded in philosophy. Only when we truly understand the humanistic appeal of the biblical prophets and Kant, we can uncompromisingly fight injustice in the name of radical universalism, not in the name of identity. That's to say, universal here is the idea that we are both noumena and phenomena, and we do not do justice to the noumenal aspect. So in that sense, we can go back to the radicality, or radically back to our universalism. So even Kant, for example, might fall short in doing justice to its own idea, but the idea of separating noumena with phenomena is what can inform us in our political action taking. So contrastingly to liberal radicalism, speculative humanism articulated by Hegel, emphasizes communicative freedom as concrete universalism. Here, freedom encompasses the capacity to succeed and to fail without having to state an ontological difference between noumena and phenomena. Hegel's theory of punishment, for example, reflects this perspective, asserting that moral wrongness warrants appropriate legal consequences, an instant of the negation of a negation. In essence, Hegel's speculative humanism acknowledges the complexities of human freedom, recognizing that it entails both the potential for ethical action and the possibility for transgression, echoing the contradictory nature of life. Hegel's philosophy elucidates the intricate relationship between negation, freedom, and societal progress. While the negation of negation serves as a mechanism for advancing the spirit's objective, the realization of communicative freedom necessitates the cultivation of practices of negation within civil society. Hegel's circle of circles symbolizes the potential for emancipation through acknowledging and setting free and productive the transformative power of contradiction. In Hegel's framework, art, religion, and philosophy emerge as vehicles for forgiveness, offering avenues for commemorating wrongdoing and pursuing reconciliation beyond the legal framework of the negation of a negation. Art, in its societal function, serves to illuminate and the multifaceted, inherently human aspect of the spirit, showcasing its noble aspirations and also its fallible tendencies. So, having said this, I'd like to turn now to the question of the colonial wrong, and that's my last paragraph here. So, and that brings me back to the notion of magnanimity, which is inherently entwined with social power dynamics. And this is kind of the, let's say, point of departure for Robert Brandom. So I like to use this idea as a normative standard, but I think we have to spell it out differently and, let's say, critically assessing the reality of power dynamics we find our lives in. It is a privilege afforded to those who can forgive and transcend negation by negation. To forgive is to negate, and what is forgiven is a perpetration. That's also a negation. In that sense, it's a negation of a negation. Learning to accommodate contradictions within our societal fabric becomes imperative in navigating substantial, persistent wrongs and grappling with historical guilt. Reflecting on the Enlightenment's legacy prompts critically inquiry into the Enlightenment's relation to slavery and colonialism. Suppose the problem of colonial violence and its persistence is linked to displacement and also to dispossession. In this case, the suggestion is tempting of a cure, a healing, or a recovery, which comes from finding a home or returning home. The rites of return circumvent any simple nostalgia. So Saidiya Hartman, for example, is rather skeptical of return and reparation, since the Middle Passage is a case of permanent rupture. A more reparative sense of attachment to ancestors and to place or space, we might say, is present in invocations of indigenous spiritualities or long traditions of connections to a region. Taking these ideas of negation seriously also reminds us of a tension between indigenous and diasporic perspectives that can't and should not be easily papered over. Displacement or dispossession of one's land are substantially different, despite both being forms of violent exploitation. To borrow a phrase from Anne Sechkovich here, politically at stake is a sense of place as marked by multiple histories. Can we appropriate Hegel's merits while acknowledging the Eurocentrism and anti-blackness in his account of world history? The notion of emancipation from slavery evolves beyond the narratives of noblesse, obliged to one rooted in struggle, risk, and sacrifice on the part of the enslaved. Thinkers like Marx, Fanon, and Butler offer insight into these complex issues, challenging conventional perspectives and advocating for a more nuanced understanding of liberation and social justice. Based on the idea of contradiction as the logical structure of life, my question is, can we understand Hegel's notion of actualization as a process of determinate negation leading to norms that can be understood as precarious and ambivalent, yet granting trust and reconciliation? It is crucial, and I think it does align with Hegel's thinking, to not conflate forgiving with forgetting. Merely forgetting wrongs leads to abstract negation, which does not break the circle of violence. What would its concrete negation entail? If we are to uphold the idea of critical and speculative humanism, the very idea of a concrete universal based on trust and respect needs actualization. This requires putting into practice the notion of communicative reflection as self-criticism. The actuality of Western norms of freedom is held captive by a conception of freedom tied to an idea of self-sufficiency and exploitation. Along the lines of immanent critique, it is held captive by varieties of abstractions. So the idea of an identity as based on exploitation is an abstraction from what it is to be an identity, so to speak. I mean, this brings us back to the ontological question of what it means to be expressively oneself in the other. The possibility of critical intervention, to follow Zambrana here again, reside in the insight into the necessity of the continuous production and resilience of such unintelligibility, of such unreason, hence of such unfreedom. So it's real. Exploitation is real. Therefore, the very fact of something unintelligible is something we have to cope with. There is the idea of precariousness is meant to spell out the existence of the prevailing existence of unreason, and that is the reason why I think self-criticism is so crucial. Self-criticism takes the materialism of trust seriously. That is to say, the questions of gendered and racialized capitalism. The idealism of a plurality of life as the actuality of the community of trust is the idea that gives life to the concreteness of the spirit as a reciprocal, communicative being bound by a shared world. Therefore, we must continue to reframe the frames of recognition. In other words, the time is urgent. Why do we have to read Hegel in these times? To love the world despite its problems and contradictions, to cultivate, as Hannah Arendt would say, an attitude of amor mundi. I think this means to grasp the world conceptually. We must cultivate amor mundi if the world of the spirit is to endure. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't been running out of time too much, and I'm looking forward for your questions. And like I said, les quiero invitar a hacer sus preguntas en castellano, inglés, lo que sea. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Tobías Wieland por la conferencia. Supongo que para hacer preguntas necesitamos un micrófono especial, pero los invito a hacer sus preguntas a los asistentes. Levante la mano, por favor, quien tenga alguna pregunta. A ver, se presenta, por favor, dice quién es, ¿ya? Y tú nos dices, Tobías, si es que escuchas bien.
Hello, am I audible?
Sí.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the lecture. It's been pretty interesting. So I have a question about the master and slave dialectic. How the experience of negation and the cheerful labor leads to a higher level of self-consciousness than the initial state of dominance of the master. In that sense, being able to be freer than the master by a principle of self-determination. Thank you.
A higher level of consciousness. The question of why I do think that the servant is in an epistemically, let's say, not better, but in an epistemically more advanced position. Is that the question? Sorry, just to make sure that I get it right.
Yeah, that's the question.
I mean, the idea here is that the slave is apt to understand the thinking of the master, anticipating the master's desire, and relate its own set of desires, that is the desire to survive, to this set of conditions he finds himself in. So in that sense, he is in a more privileged position. He understands the thinking and the triggers, we might say, and the psychology of the master in order to survive, actually, because otherwise he would run into the struggle over life and death again, and then it would not be a safe zone, so to speak, for him to survive. In this sense, he anticipates the master's thinking, and also the engagement with the object. So that's the other reason. So he anticipates the potential struggles, but also he's apt and capable of dealing with the world and making the external world obey, but not just according to its own desires, but according to the desires of the masters. So this idea of technology, the work, the labor, as something that the Promethean understanding of labor is something that allows us to make the external world obey. That is also the other reason why he has a better grip on objectivity. So he understands two subjects, his own and the master's, plus the mechanism of the object, so to speak, whereas the master is stuck in itself. See, in that sense, he's epistemically in a less privileged position. Sorry, does this address your question?
Yeah, thank you. It is more clear. Thank you.
Ok. ¿Había otra pregunta aquí adelante? Julio Marchena.
Hola.
Hi, Todia.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
¿Cómo estás? Thank you for nice talk. Yo tengo una pregunta
Adelante.
que parte de este comentario, que es que me gustó mucho la interpretación dialéctica de la lucha por el reconocimiento en los términos de magnanimidad y perdón que señalas hacia el final, ¿no? Tomando en cuenta las reflexiones de Brandon al respecto. Es entonces en esta figura de la magnanimidad y el perdón donde se desarrolla la dialéctica de la negación, ¿no es cierto? Entonces mi pregunta a partir de ese comentario es la siguiente. Desde el primer momento señalaste claramente que hay algunos temas hegelianos que no necesariamente se están tomando en esta reflexión en torno a la pluralidad de formas de vida en particular. Y una de ellas, si entendí bien al inicio, era esta visión, digámosle, metafísica del Hegel de las lecciones de filosofía de la historia, por ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces mi pregunta viene porque, si bien es cierto, la magnanimidad y el perdón están desarrollados en esta lógica de la dialéctica de la lucha por reconocimiento, también en la filosofía de la historia podemos encontrar una lógica de la negación en términos análogos, digo yo, a la noción de perdón, ¿no? Teniendo en cuenta específicamente la noción de providencia, que es problemática, por supuesto, pero que todo esto lo señalo porque mi pregunta va justamente al papel de la magnanimidad en el sistema, ¿no? O, en otras palabras, si se puede interpretar o hacer esa actualización hegeliana, ¿no? En base a distinguir algunos conceptos solamente y no en relación con el lugar de los mismos en otras partes de su obra, ¿no? Sistemática. No sé si me has entendido del todo, tal vez podamos
No sé si
luego.
está bien.
¿Sí?
Sí.
Gracias.
A mi parecer, Brandon's engagement with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit happens within the context of what we might call post-analytical philosophy. Yeah, and I think his question is more about the pragmatics of a community of scorekeeping and this idea of the pragmatic idea of commitments and how we keep trace track of our commitments. And so if I trust you, Julio, and you trust someone else, I think Brandon's idea is that I also trust that other person. So this is what I try to capture with this idea of the transitivity of trust. And I think there is something in this. Yeah, I do think this is definitely a finding, so to speak, worth capturing. So if we are to trust each other, I think this expands. So trust is expansive. Yeah, it's logically expanding. So I cannot just end myself with the trust I grant to you. I trust you. If you trust someone else, I trust them. Yeah. But at the same time, this problem of wrongness. What happens if you're, to use this Brandonian term, if you're keeping track of the other's commitment is not trustworthy? So you trust someone who's not trustworthy. You trust the perpetrator. What shall I do with this transitivity? And I think what Hegel tries to look at is that we have to look for practices of commemoration. That's to say, practices of making these conflicts explicit. So think of a tragedy. Yeah, a tragedy in this kind of ancient understanding puts as display a constellation of trust. So Antigone and Sophocles, we have these constellations of someone trusts the conventions, trusts their people, and then expands, and they run into a conflict with someone else. I think the idea here is that we need some practices such as art to present us in a form of alienation with certain tragedies and conflicts, so we can discuss these the standards by which we keep track of our commitments. And I think this is what lacks Brandon's Hegel, so to speak. Yeah, Brandon's Hegel is a bit too harmonistic in this idea. There is little to no space for the problem of wrongness in the sense. It's not a very dialectical understanding in the end of the day. I just wanted to pick up this idea of a recognition that is based on the fight for recognition as something that we can put in terms of trust and link this to the logical structure of contradiction, and then to ask the question of what to do with the perpetrator. And I think here the negation of the negation comes to play, and this is not Brandonian. I think I'm pushing it a bit further than Hegel does, but I'm not a post-analytical thinker neither. So it's not, for me, the question is not about how can we understand meaning or semantics. My question is more political, and I don't think Brandon is interested in the politicality of trust. So I see little to no space in his thinking dedicated to the relation of trust and privilege. It's more like a ontological thing. It's something that we all shall do, and it's laudable, and trust is a good thing. I mean, it is, but there is too little awareness to the complexities of trust. And that's what I wanted to bring this discussion to. Yeah. Hope this helps with your question.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. ¿Había otra pregunta? Sí, aquí adelante, a ver.
Well, hello, my name is Hans. Very pleased to meet you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, I have two questions. One is little, and the answer is needed for the second one. Well, will you say Hegel was racist?
Yes.
Well, so my second question is, we study Hegel, we used to talk about the things that he done, but when someone talks about, we talk about the possible things that Hegel did, but when someone talk about some qualities of other person that was racist, like Hitler, is something that is very criticized, very polemic. So I would like to know, in your opinion, what is this correct? Is this incorrect? What is the difference studying a racist and other one in their positive qualities?
I mean, to be very honest, the question whether or not he was a racist is not of my greatest concern, because for sure, I mean, there is definitely a racist picture. My question when it comes to these exegetical question is, what kind of racist was he? Yeah, was he culturalist, naturalist, abolitionist, gradualist? There are many kinds of racism, and they differ in how they justify the colonial project and the idea to conquer the world. And I think as Hegelians, we need to take this seriously and shall not try to get rid of it by saying, he's just a child of its time. He doesn't mean it like that or so. I think it's better to take this seriously and then from there on to see what are the, let's say, the standards or the means to think again, with Hegel, so to speak. Yeah, and I think this is what we need to do.
Thank you very much.
Gracias. Allí atrás, sí.
Sí, buenas tardes. Mi pregunta es sobre qué deberíamos hacer para mantener vigente a Hegel en la tardomodernidad. No sé, de repente separar la dialéctica hegeliana de Hegel, separar la dialéctica hegeliana de la totalidad de su filosofía, porque, no sé, tal vez la dialéctica hegeliana le hubiera dado la razón a Marx con que la explotación y la alienación no solo son un estado temporal que luego llevará a la superación dialéctica, sino más bien son un problema que se hace permanente, no a forma de negación para la superación, sino a forma de un estado permanente de enajenación que se consolida y es muy difícil de desarmar. Si bien podemos decir que la filosofía de Hegel era eurocéntrica y hasta racista o exclusivista, creo que el proyecto de la dialéctica no tiene un final. Si Hegel llegó hasta cierto punto del recorrido del espíritu y hasta cierto punto de la lucha por el reconocimiento, tal vez hubiera llegado a pensar que la negación de la libertad es justamente aceptar que la libertad ya ha sido consolidada por las instituciones modernas cuando en realidad no la ha sido. Y si no ha sido consolidada aún, entonces tal vez la misma dialéctica hegeliana iba a poder lograr la superación de esta negación de la negación de la que hablaba Marx.
¿Está usted citando a alguien? No.
No.
No, es suyo el texto que ha leído.
Acabo de estructurar más o menos.
Bueno, ya, listo, gracias. Sí, está clara la pregunta.
Sí. Sí, la verdad que sí. Wow, no, you made a sharp point. I mean, in the end of the day, it kind of depends on, yeah, if I may, the trust we have in the very notion of dialectics. I mean, this idea of understanding dialectics is something that is beyond its origin, so to speak, that we can use it against Hegel. I mean, this is what drives all these critical inquiries that we have in Hegelianism. And I have a rather broad conception of Hegelianism. Let's say I integrate Marx Marx for me is a first Hegelian, so to speak. And I think Butler is another one. Fanon is an important one. So I have a broad conception of what it means to engage with the primary source of Hegel. And I think we often can systematize different Hegelianisms, so to speak, if there are, the idea of pluralism, not only in terms of forms of life, but also in terms of forms of Hegelianism. If there is such a thing as a pluralism of Hegelianisms, they differ in how much trust they have in the capacity of dialectics to really unfold and unreveal and make explicit the preconditions of its own thinking. And the idea of making explicit what is implicit in thinking, if that is a method that brings about a better, deeper, more entailing understanding of oneself, I think if you hold on to this view, then you might have a good reason why to have trust in this. If you think, no, we always run into this problem of reproducing the frames of recognition of the predominant power that we cannot overcome and not make it explicit what is at stake and what presupposes in our life, then you have a good reason why to be more skeptical about it. And I think this is, I would consider myself rather an optimist, but I do also see that there are good reasons why to be skeptic about the problems of recognition, because recognition needs a frame, and therefore it is notoriously conservative, so to speak. Yeah, and yet stressing the precariousness and the ambivalences and the openness might give reason why to be, optimistic. But this notorious conservatism in recognition, I think, is something we had to hold on to, and especially when it comes to feminist debates over the questions whether or not we can reconcile recognition and desire, the question of colonial wrongness, economic exploitation. They are all good reasons why to think we should not understand dialectics as emancipatory all the way through. Because, like I said, there is a conservatism inscribed into the exchange of recognition for struggle and labor. Hopefully I addressed your question. Your question was very good, just also very fast. So I'm not sure if I really captured all its layers.
Bueno, Hay una pregunta de Ana María Miranda que está presente en la sala de Zoom. ¿Es posible que se haga la pregunta desde la sala? Cuestión técnica. ¿Le puede dar, por favor, a Ana María Miranda el micrófono? Y si fuera posible, que pueda también abrir su pantalla. Ana María Miranda es una profesora que nos dará una conferencia hoy día por la tarde. Ana María, buenos días. A ver,
Hola,
sí,
buenos
adelante,
días.
por favor. Sí,
¿Me escuchan?
sí, te escuchamos muy bien.
Okay. Hi, Toby. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really good. I am very sympathetic to your approach. And I am happy that you introduced the topic this way because afterwards I will focus on the wrongness or what's the problem. And I really like this quote of Hathaway of staying with the trouble because it makes a lot of sense to me as well. My question is mostly, it's a small one, but because I really like your thesis that recognition presents contradiction is in the conceptual structure, and I find this very interesting. But I am not sure what's the role of communication. Like, it was not very clear to me to what extent this communicative freedom could solve all these problems that you introduced and you present very well. Thank you.
Ok,
Thank you, Anna.
muchas gracias. Sí.
I mean, the short answer to this is, I don't think that communication is meant to solve all the problems. Yeah, it will not give us the key. I think it's rather the idea to give flesh to staying with the trouble, so to speak, that we have to communicate. But again, there is this problem that I took up from Butler. I mean, that's to say, forms of recognition and communication, they presupposes standards or some sort of frames of recognition, and therefore they have this inscribed form of conservatism into this. And I think the same holds for communication. Communication is not just talk about it and then it's done. I think communication is it's a complex thing. And a bit of the longer answer, and that is something I could cut out of that paper that I presented today from a longer version that I'm about to publish. I'm adapted to Michael Teunisen's take on the science of logic. And I think it's interesting to see that what Hegel calls Mitteilung, it's translated as communication. That is to say, the ontological framework here is that we do not have to understand identity as ursprüngliche Teilung. There is nothing like an innate or primordial separation. What there is relation. And to spell this out brings me to kind of a generalized understanding of communication. Everything is in communication. So I'm really adapted to this kind of thinking. And I think that this is a lifelong project, because if we start with this, then I think we can also reassess Hegel's distinction of life and nature, or spirit and nature, that if we understand the crucial indebtedness of everything that's alive to its other, and take this speculative insight into ontology as a starting point, then we see that we have lots of traces and character traits in common with nature, because nature is communication too. It's not necessarily verbal. I don't mean by communication linguistic affairs, not necessarily. Like trees are in communication, mushrooms, fungi are in communication, and so I think this super basic ontological understanding of communication becomes extremely important when we are to reconsider linguistic and human affairs. So I think, why shall we communicate? Because we are communication, so to speak. But what are good standards of communication? And I think this is what I like to elaborate further in my own work. I have no final answer to this. I do think that we need to understand communication beyond the linguistic, and also think of somatic forms of communication. And also what I do like is, but it's not part of the paper here, but what I really liked, and I think this is in its very core also Hegelian, even though I don't find so much of text work to make the sounds. But I do think that we need to understand also the relevance of unlearning. Yeah, to learn, it's not that we have to take more and become better and become a better whatever sort of communicator. We need to undo and unlearn the inscriptions of traumata and what we have inscribed throughout the intergenerational forms of reproduction of subjectivity. And I think this idea of communication brings me close to forms of transitional justice. So how we can think of the negation of a negation, let's just say the negation of wrongness beyond the legal frame. Yeah, let's just say beyond the philosophy of rights and go into the doctrine of the absolute. What practices do we have at play when it comes to commemorate, to not forget but to forgive? I think this is different. Yeah, forgiving is keeps present or allows to commemorate the present there, but also letting go the wrongness. It's complicated, but I think this notion of communication shall bring me into this in these fields of transitional justice, transformative justice. And I think this is Hegelian in its very, thank you, in its very spirit, if not the letter.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta y por la respuesta. Ya nos acercamos al final, pero yo no quería dejar de hacer también una pregunta, pero en primer lugar agradecerle mucho a Tobias Wieland por la riqueza de su conferencia. Hay muchos temas que han sido desarrollados en la exposición que me parece que son muy importantes para la discusión a lo largo de todo este seminario, ¿no? En relación con el problema entre el Señor y el siervo en la fenomenología, el problema del reconocimiento, el problema entre la filosofía de la historia y lo que estaba en ciernes en ese tema del reconocimiento, la idea de combatir a Hegel con el propio Hegel, que es algo que va a ocurrir muchas veces en este seminario, ya lo vamos a ver, el problema del mal, el humanismo especulativo, la crítica anticolonial. En fin, hay muchos temas, sobre todo, por supuesto, la idea de reflexionar sobre las características de la contradicción en la lógica y su aplicabilidad a los problemas del reconocimiento. En fin, yo quisiera hacer una pregunta sobre el perdón, porque es un tema que me irrita un poco en relación, en general, ¿no? Pero en relación también con la filosofía de Hegel. Claro que el perdón, ¿no? Forgiveness ha sido mencionado en relación con to forget, ¿no? Con el olvido, el perdón y el olvido. Evidentemente el olvido no tiene cabida en la filosofía de Hegel, pero yo no estoy muy seguro de que lo tenga el perdón, ¿no? Hay un famoso pasaje de Hegel al final de la sección espíritu, ¿no? El mal y su perdón, ¿no? Das Böse und seine Verzeihung, que en realidad desembocaría, creo yo, en una dinámica de reconocimiento, porque no puede haber perdón en el sentido de, digamos, del olvido, digamos, el verbo perdonar se conjuga de dos maneras diferentes, cualitativamente distintas. Una cosa es que pedir perdón y otra cosa es exigir que alguien pida perdón, ¿no es cierto? El Estado debe pedir perdón por los crímenes que puede haber cometido, pero nadie está obligado individualmente a pedir perdón. Esa asimetría entre el perdón que podemos exigir de una autoridad política, pero que no podemos exigir de una persona individualmente. Ese es un tema que yo creo que en Hegel digamos, tampoco está presente como una necesidad del espíritu, ¿no? El
Ujú.
espíritu, más bien, sí puede uno decir que exige relaciones de reconocimiento, ¿no? Por eso es que en ese mismo capítulo dice Hegel, las heridas del espíritu se pueden curar sin dejar cicatrices, ¿no? ¿Ah? Ohne das Narben bleiben, ¿no? Die Wunden des Geistes können geheilt werden, ohne das Narben bleiben. Bueno, esa es la pregunta.
Sí, sí, muchas gracias. Sí, veo bien a dónde vas. Um, I mean, this observation of the asymmetrical character of asking for forgiveness and granting forgiveness, that's a crucial point. I did not have the time to elaborate on this, but it's very important because I do think that one of the systematic questions is, and I think this is where I depart from Hegel, I do must say, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that some of our wounds we inflicted upon us do not heal and curate without sacrifices, without cicatrices, without scars. Yeah. So I think Hegel is a bit too optimistic that the act of forgiving will render in like everything is curatable. Yeah, everything is fixable, and I'm not sure. I'm more pessimistic in this regards than Hegel is, and plus, and this is what I tried to shed lights on in regards to Brandom. I think the asymmetry of I cannot ask for forgiveness, but I can grant, or vice versa. Yeah, this is also societal and political. Yeah, so those who inflicted wrongness, if they ask for forgiveness, they need to negate their own wrongness. So there must be punishment. I do think that we need a form of punishment, and that's to say that goes beyond reparation, that goes beyond a legal form of punishment. But I think we have to think of the relevance of an act of sacrifice on the perpetrator's side as giving reason why to forgive that person and insight. So you need to inflict pain on yourself and show that you learned something. Then this is how you ask for forgiveness, and not by asking literally, not by saying please forgive me, but by self-punishment, self-criticism, and presenting a learning. And I think Hegel is a bit too we need to move on. But I do think that some of the wounds we inflicted on each other are not fixable by just forgiving, and therefore not all of the wounds will heal without scarification. Some scars, they will lead, and they can be beautiful, and not all the scars are ugly, so to speak. But that's it's a longer topic. But thank you for the question, because this is actually the direction I'd like to push this thinking forward to.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Vamos a despedir al profesor Wieland con un fuerte aplauso.
Muchas gracias. Sí, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Tobías, por esa magnífica conferencia. Y los y las invitamos a la segunda conferencia plenaria del día de hoy a las 3 de la tarde. La profesora Ana María Miranda continuará con este tipo de reflexiones con la conferencia titulada El legado ambivalente de Hegel en América Latina, provincializando a Hegel. Hasta las 3 de la tarde. Hasta luego.
Sí, muchas gracias. Ahí los veo.